Welcome to this episode of Season 5 of The Common Bridge, where policy and current events are discussed in a fiercely nonpartisan manner. The host, Richard Helppie, is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and political analyst who has reached over 4 million listeners, viewers, and readers around the world. With our surging growth in audience and subscriptions, The Common Bridge continues to expand its reach. The show is available on the Substack website and the Substack app. Simply search for The Common Bridge. You can also find us on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. The Common Bridge draws guests and audiences from across the political spectrum, and we invite you to become a free or paid subscriber on your favorite medium.
Hello, welcome to The Common Bridge. I'm your host, Rich Helppie. Today we have a very important and very sensitive topic with a woman that's been on the front lines. You might want to caption it as transgender rights. You might want to caption it as transgender ideology. And there's other descriptions, of course. So we welcome today from Northern California, Beth Bourne. Beth, welcome to The Common Bridge, and thank you so much for taking time to tell us your story and your experience.
Thank you for having me.
Beth, our audience on The Common Bridge, our listeners, our readers, and our viewers like to know a little bit about our guests. So if you don't mind, maybe a little biography. Where did you spend your early days, and maybe what's your career and personal arc been like, and what's brought you to this day today?
Sure. Well, I am in my early 50s. I have 2 kids. I grew up overseas. My father was with the U.S. Embassy, so we did live internationally. I had conservative parents who are down in San Diego. I myself, in college, became a liberal and have been a registered Democrat for 30 years. And so that's what sort of makes this an interesting story, is that I have always been on the progressive left. But when my daughter, back in 2018, began to identify as transgender, it really made me question where are we going with some of these views that are coming, I believe, more from the left side around gender ideology. I work for the university here in my town, and I'm surrounded by other liberal parents because I'm in a blue city in a blue state here in Davis, California. But yeah, that's sort of where I'm at.
And tell me, when did your daughter first come to you with the notion that she was indeed a boy and not a girl? How old was she?
So she would have been 13. 2 years earlier, she declared that she was bisexual, and at the time, I didn't realize that all of these terms in the LGBTQIA plus, these definitions were being introduced here in the public schools. So I think that's maybe an important part of the story, is that, as young as fifth, sixth grade, kids are being asked in schools to label their sexual preferences and then also their gender identity. And so when she made the announcement to me, it was 2018, so almost 6 years ago, when she was 13.
So 2 years prior, so she'd be 11 years old, and the public school systems asking her whether she was heterosexual, lesbian. All right, I'll begin again. Okay, great. All right, thanks, Brian. So, Beth, if I understand what you're saying, that when your daughter was 11 years old, in the public school, as part of her curriculum, unbeknownst to you as a parent, that she was being asked whether she was heterosexual, lesbian, bisexual, or perhaps something else at 11 years old?
It's correct. I don't think people are aware, and I wasn't, of course, until just the last couple of years. But we have a whole new kind of curriculum that's coming in through the science class starting in fifth and sixth grade, as well as the library books, picture books, books, in the elementary school, that really give a message to kids that there's so many options that they can choose from. And I think they're trying to be open-minded and let kids know maybe that there's these other identities or other sexualities. But I personally believe it's too young for children to get introduced to these ideas, and that it leads to some confusion around um, their teen years or their puberty, adolescent years, where they should really be exploring who they are and not setting these labels at this really young age. So I think that's where some of the confusion comes, is that we're asking children to sort of give labels to themselves at a young age.
Indeed. I recall at that time of life, we had basically classes on reproduction, and the, young women went into one room, and us young guys went into another one, and we learned about reproductive health and how babies were made. And gosh, at that time we didn't even talk about how to prevent um, what was then called venereal disease. So it's very unusual that I think that things would be going beyond reproduction, but that's just me. I'm wondering. I've heard lots of support coming out for including President Biden saying he supports gender affirming care, and you, though, as a parent, saying, "Gosh, how do they even know?" And yet we've got this medicalization complex coming at them full gangbusters. It, you know, I need some help bridging that gap. How do you get from an 11-year-old being asked a question that they don't understand to the weight of the presidency of the United States with our current president and the whole medical industrial complex coming at them? Doesn't seem like a very fair fight to me, but I must be missing.
That's so true. And I honestly, I'm a liberal, so I've always supported our public schools and our unions and our democratic local officials, and up through our president. But I didn't realize that this, and I want to call it, radical gender ideology, right? The idea that human sex is no longer binary and immutable, and that human beings can now change their sex using experimental drugs and surgeries. So I did not realize that it was being introduced, not only at the higher level with, world organizations like Human Resource, I'm sorry, the HRC and the ACLU, but then also, within our school system, it came down through the California Teachers Association, so the teachers union at the state level, and then it came through at the local level through our teachers union as far as doing the trainings. And then the materials just all came in through our Department of Education here in California. So we have a very super majority, at the state level with the Democrats. So it's very easy for them to bring in new curriculum and new policies. But I had no idea it was sort of like, the assault on children and their reality was at all levels of government and throughout the school system. So there was really no way to opt out. Um, I didn't know at the time in 2018, but even now, it's almost impossible to opt out your child, pull them out of the curriculum that has to do with gender and sexuality, because it's pervasive in all areas of the school.
Now, I'm wondering, uh, look, we want to be a free and open and supportive society, and that's part of our Constitution to to strive for a more perfect union. And indeed, we've been imperfect. That um, we all know the history of slaves. We all know about women's suffrage, um, and so marginalized groups looking to get a voice. And clearly, when we go to the Civil Rights Act, you can say there's a wrong that we were trying to right. We look at the Voting Rights Act, there's wrongs we were trying to right. Um, in that context, what goals were being pursued or what wrongs were attempted to be right. How is this explained to you as a citizen, a parent, and a taxpayer?
So I think what they've done is they've sort of jumped on the bandwagon for some of these other, civil rights issues, right? And so when the same-sex marriage was passed so easily, we had all these organizations that had been formed around fighting for that. And so you had all the strength within these organizations that needed to keep, fundraising and have a purpose. And so they picked the idea of, let's fight for transgender rights. And that means for, men who identify as women to be in our spaces, prisons, bathrooms, shelters. And then also this medical side of let's make sure that we can give um, kids, and adults, these gender affirming, the whole idea of giving experimental drugs and surgeries to minors as well as adults, that just became part of their rights, like a civil rights movement. um, and within the schools here in California, a big issue is that teachers and school counselors are allowed to socially transition a child at school. So if they hear a child comes up to their teacher and says, can you please start using this new name? And I want to go by these new pronouns. I want to use he, him, or he, they. And can you also please, make sure you don't tell my parents because I'm not ready to come out to them, or they might not be supportive. And in California, we've actually, I don't think many parents realize this, but the schools will, secretly transition a child at school. And they're saying it's because it's a privacy right that students have. But, I would argue that parents should have the right to raise their child and keep them safe. So there's a lot happening within specific school districts here in California to fight that. But yeah, I think they really did try to say this is, a civil rights issue, but it's actually taking away the rights of women. And I believe, and that's why I did this, this expose with Kaiser, is that the medical side of it is harming, vulnerable people and young kids' bodies, and it's making a profit for the gender industry.
Indeed, and the excellent investigative journalism you did about your own experience with Kaiser, and I do recommend everybody read that. Where can people find the article you wrote about your experience with Kaiser?
It was published by Colin Wright. He's a PhD evolutionary biologist. He actually got a degree from UC Davis and the University of California at Santa Barbara. And he was kind of canceled from academia for speaking out on this while he was a postdoc, I believe at Penn State. So he has a Substack or a publication called Reality's Last Stand. His name is Colin Wright, and it's published under my name there. So Beth Bourne. And I think if you just go to Kaiser non-binary mother or something like that, you would find it. But
Okay. All right. So Colin Wright, Reality's Last Stand,
yes,
on Substack and other sites, and
right.
where he's been writing about this. And it sounds like he's very well um, qualified. And speaking of that, as a scientist, what does the science say today? I've done a lot of reading on this. I'm not a scientist, but I have to tell you, I have not been able to find a single citation of any study that says injecting kids with what is effectively chemical castration and foreign hormones and then medicalization further with permanently altering surgeries does anything. And in fact, the opposite. If you look at England, their health service said that it doesn't do any of the so-called good, like stopping suicidal ideation. But I'm not up to speed on all the science. What does the science say that you might be exposed to?
Well, that was an excellent summary. I didn't realize that the science books here in my children's schools. Here in California, they adopted a new science book, biology, and a new AP biology, so advanced placement biology. And within these biology books, they actually put language that says that scientists are just discovering this new, idea that we have transgender people, and then they give a definition that being transgender means the doctor, when they assigned your birth, that they, made a mistake, and that you are actually, where you were born in a boy body, but you're actually a girl, or, a girl body who's actually a boy. So they put this definition in the science textbooks. And I have a very intelligent child. And so for them to read something that looks, it's in the science book, it's in black and white, they're being tested on it. It'd be hard for a young person not to think that there's some truth behind it. But, I like you're saying, there is no science that shows that mammals or humans can change their biological sex. It wouldn't make any sense. We've had evolution for 4 billion years. So why would we all of a sudden have this huge number of kids, identifying as being transgender?
Well,
So
look, hermaphroditism is indeed a scientific based condition. Um, people that have both male and female genitalia, that even at a chromosomal level, it's hard to discern. It's very rare.
right,
And there are people that get into adulthood and decide that they want to live as the opposite gender. Um, I personally, a mentally competent adult, as far as I'm concerned, can do whatever they want to do. Um, and that's where I come back to what's the the distress that these changes in the educational program are trying to solve. Did we have an epidemic of children saying that they were going to harm themselves or other people if they didn't go through this treatment, or they were being maltreated in some way? What was the societal objective for bringing these programs into children, 11-year-old children?
right.
What have you been told in your investigation of this?
Well, I'll go back to that, but real quickly on the idea of intersex being sort of evidence that we have transgender people. That's what they presented in my daughter's science textbook, right? They say that we've had, intersex, DSM. It's a variation in your sexual development, but even, somebody who is intersex, you only can produce large gametes or small, so you only can produce eggs or sperm. So there is no sense of being intersex because your body only can produce one or the other. But they do give that as an example of how there's this spectrum of gender, because we have it, intersex, which has really nothing to do with your sexuality in the sense of do you produce eggs or sperm? But so going back to the idea of why do we have kids being told they might be transgender? I've just been thinking about it myself, and I do think it, for the adults who want to live their lives in the opposite sex. So for men who, would like to be what we used to call in the past, cross dressers or transsexual, or maybe, not as common, but you might have women that like to dress in male attire, or call themselves men. I think it's to give validity to what they're doing, right? If we just say this happens when you're an adult because you enjoy wearing this other clothing or having this other appearance or having these surgeries. If you could instead say, well, it happens to children, as young as, we learned in Davis that as young as 2 years old, kids know that they are already in the wrong body. So that's where I think it's coming from. It's to give the adults, some kind of validity to say it happens to children. But if you're introducing a very, very, you're almost leading kids to believe they could be in the wrong body because you're presenting all these ideas to them. And then you're, in a classroom, you might have the flags for the Progress Pride flag. You might have, pronoun pins being worn by the teachers and the paraeducators that have their pronouns announced. You might have, all this material. And when a child comes out as being transgender at school, they get celebrated. So, not only are you giving all these ideas and having the flags and the rainbows and the pronouns, but then you're also, when a child comes out, this could be a child that's lonely or maybe, just a quirky kid. They get all this attention that they might not have gotten otherwise. And so it's, that's why to me, it doesn't seem like a safe situation for young people.
I mean, it hurts my heart to hear that they might be influenced like that. And before we get into talking about your experience with Kaiser, one of the pieces I read about you talked about something about a standard letter for your daughter. And I perked up at that phrase, like, what exactly is a standard letter?
So was that like the coming out letter that she gave me? Is that what you're thinking
Yes,
of? Or
yes.
right. So when she was 13, she gave me a sealed envelope and she said, "This letter's for you." And in the letter, and it was handwritten. It said, "Dear Mom, I want you to know that, I'm sharing this news with you. This is my new name. These are my new pronouns. I've spoken, with my teachers and counselors. Um, you know, this is how I would like for you to treat me, and please, let me share it with other people." Um, that was the first letter. And then a week later, the letter said, "Now that I've, thought about this, I would also like to consider using, a breast binder and then getting on puberty blockers and testosterone because I know that WPATH and Planned Parenthood, they've said it's safe." So these two different kind of, I call them scripts almost, or templates that kids can find online. It's just like a standard letter that they can use to write to their parents, or to other people. Share it with your grandparents. But the language is there for them, right? How do you make this big announcement, and then how do you let your parents know, or what other people in your life, from the counselors to the teachers and your pediatrician, what you want. So a couple of years later, I realized how much this is just laid out for kids, what you need to do, to transition. And if you have a child like mine who's very hardworking and, a straight A student who likes to check things off the box and, likes to be praised for doing good work and, meeting her goals. And if you're in a really hard time in your life and you're looking for some direction, to have this checklist of how do I become, transgender, a person of the opposite sex. I thought it was, very seductive or alluring to her to have it laid out there for her like that.
Yeah, it sounds almost legalistic. And just a couple of things that I have been out trying to get like trans law centers and people like that to come on the show and talk about their work and what they're up to. Have not been successful at getting anyone to accept an invitation yet. But for anybody that happened to be listening or reading or watching this, we'd love to have you on the show. You can reach the same audience, and give us a counter balance. And in recent days, that now WPATH, which has been kind of setting a worldwide standard, has now backed off of the use of puberty blockers and synthetic hormones for underage youth. And it's, Sweden, Finland, United Kingdom are closing their transgender operations for kids. And yet it seems to be on the upswing in the United States. So, Beth, let's shift a little bit to your experience. So, you had a notion that how hard would it be to get gender affirming care?
That
And you thought maybe you'd just be a great investigative journalist, go undercover, and see how hard or how easy it was. Now I see you sitting here. Must have been really hard because I can't tell from this view whether you've had any uh, uh, work done. I guess the way to put
Right,
it.
right.
Um, so let's take me from the beginning of that. What did you decide to do, and what was the first step you took?
Okay, so this is going back to 2022, and my daughter was had just turned 17, and she'd actually a few weeks earlier had asked for no contact with me. So and that's very common when these kids are in this kind of cult, where if you have a parent who doesn't affirm, your transgender identity, that you should cut them off. So I'm just bringing that up because it gave me a lot of freedom to go this route with this investigative, journalism that I was doing. Um, and I also realized if she had just turned 17, that means a year from then, on her 18th birthday, she would be able to walk into the Kaiser Gender Clinic and have her top surgery or start, testosterone or whatever procedure she wanted without any parents there. Because at
Well,
18,
let's not mince words here. So top surgery
sorry, I
is
should use the right word.
her healthy breast would be removed
Right,
as if she had were stricken with
exactly.
something horrible like breast cancer.
Right. It's a cosmetic bilateral mastectomy is what it is the term we should be using. So that's another good question. Why are children learning in school about, top surgery, um, rather than learning, the correct scientific or, the medical term for what you're really doing to a young person? But that's not what they learn. They learn, that there's top surgeries and bottom surgeries. Um, Okay, but going back to 2022, when I first came up with this idea, I was, worried about my daughter turning 18, and I got a letter from Kaiser that they were having a cervical cancer screening, recommending that I have one done for individuals over 21 to 65 years old. And when I saw the language in there, this is a letter from my OBGYN, kind of struck me is they're not even using the word woman to tell me that I need to come in for this cervical cancer screening, right? It's just saying an individual with the cervix. And so I kind of pushed back on this idea with my doctor, and I said, why are you using this term? And she said Kaiser wants to be inclusive of, their trans patients and their gender fluid patients. And so I pushed back further and I said, can you please, change the language to at least mention women? And, when she said that they weren't going to make any changes, but that she had shared this information with their administrator, I just decided at that moment, it was just like spur of the moment. I just said, well, then in that case, please change my records to show that I'm non binary and I use they, them pronouns. And I would like to start, looking into testosterone and top surgery. So I actually used that term. And so I got an email back within 45 minutes saying that my records had been changed and that they were, there to help me meet my goals and that I'd be, contacted soon by, it was my primary care physician. And so that's all it took to have my records changed. And I had the same experience with my daughter, when she was 14 at a wellness visit with her. It was a visiting pediatrician. My daughter was sick with dizziness. And when they overheard my ex-husband use these he, him pronouns to address my daughter, her pediatrician said, to the parents in this very excited way, I hear you're using, different pronouns. And then she looked at my daughter and said, does this mean you would like to have your records changed? And, we can change your name. So I'd seen it done with my daughter. And they even, that same visit, they said, you can go to a gender clinic here in Oakland called the Pride Clinic and have, it's a one-stop shop, to meet with a gender specialist, a social worker, an OBGYN, and an endocrinologist. And I had called back and spoke, in private to this pediatrician. I said, how dare you ever suggest my daughter medicalization, without first discussing it with us. So I had seen that happen with my daughter, but, I was surprised. I'm a 50, 3-year-old woman, that they would so quickly just change my records and then put me on this path of medicalizing my body. So that's sort of where it started. And it just was one step after the other, where there was no concern about why I would be asking for these procedures, to change my body, even though I kept bringing up these red flags of, mental distress.
Well,
But
one
yeah,
thing that I was curious about, like when someone goes in for cosmetic surgery, okay, whatever it might be, it could be, breast augmentation, could be eyelid lift, what do they call it when they pull your face back? Facelift. Um, I know that the first question the plastic surgeon will ask is, what do you expect from this procedure? That they want to know, like, do you have reasonable, emotional and psychiatric expectations for this? Were you ever asked those questions?
the question that they would ask me is what are your goals? And so, the goals actually for all of these procedures, it's really just about your appearance, right? That's what they're asking is if your goal, and I could just,
What
I don't know
what
if you
did
can
what
see
did
this.
you tell him your goal was?
Oh, so okay, so this is like an example for top surgery. It's like identifying your goals. Are your goals to have, flatness in your breast, to have nipple sensation, or, because you're worried about scarring? So they're all, you know, appearance based, except for the nipple sensation. But so I guess,
But that presumes you're gonna
yes,
have the procedure,
right,
not
right.
not whether you're going to have it. But when they ask you what your goals were,
Yeah.
wasn't there a question about why would you want to have your healthy breasts removed? Like, wouldn't
Yes.
that did they ask you about that?
So I guess when they ask you for your goals, it's all about, how do you want to look when this, when with this gender affirming care? And so when I met, it was actually the first mental health assessment. There's only two. The first one is, an hour and a half. The second one is much shorter. That's all they do for, a major surgery, a mastectomy that's, only cosmetic. And that's same for the phalloplasty, which is, having a fake phallus or penis. I did that treatment too, or I got the referral for it. But in this mental health assessment, she just asked me, when I told her that I was non-binary, which, non-binary, I don't really know how that's possible. You could not be, a man or a woman, but I told them I was non-binary. And I think that gave me a lot of latitude really to make up whatever I wanted, right? Because in this case, I said my goal as a non-binary person is to look more masculine, and I said I have always been a really sporty, young person. When I was a kid, I had three older brothers. I liked to ride motocross bikes. I helped my dad with mowing the lawn and working, in the wood shop. So I just said I always felt more like, I was kind of male. And so what I was asking from Kaiser was to make me look more male. And so I asked for testosterone so I could have some facial hair. And then I asked if I could have, a flatter appearance and look, more masculine. But, when I first started the call, she said, I want you to know that Kaiser has, other gender affirming care that we could offer you. And she brought up body contouring. And then you can also have your face masculinized. They can do these facial surgeries. And then she brought up they call it lower surgery. So,
So they
so yeah, it's
they
almost
were
like a
up they
menu.
were
Like,
instead of saying, "Are you sure you wanna do this?" They're kinda upselling you.
Thanks for joining us on The Common Bridge. Subscribe to The Common Bridge on Substack.com or use their Substack app where you can find more interviews, columns, videos, and nonpartisan discussions of the day. Just search for The Common Bridge. You can also find The Common Bridge on Mission Control Radio or your Radio Garden app.